Well, this is last week we've ended Ephesians, which you heard about, but this morning's message is in some ways kind of a continuation of the message on the armor of God, which I preached last week. And I wanted to just say to Lana that I felt like what she did was actually something I needed this morning, because in preparing this message, it was one of those ones, I don't know, it's sometimes when you're a pastor and you're preparing your messages, you know, it just comes easy. It's like a flood from the Holy Spirit, and you write it out, and it's like, oh man, this is really good. That was not one of these weeks this week. This was one of those ones where you're writing and you're thinking, this is terrible. I hope people like it, and you realize halfway done, I think I'm just ranting about stuff I'm angry about. You know, have you ever done that as a preacher? You realize after, okay, this is a message to me. Anyway, I'm hoping that's not what this is, and it was one of those ones where,
we'll give you a good score anyway.
Yeah, I was up late last night, so now I'm super tired after doing this, and now I don't even know. So I'm going to pray that God, you'll help me to preach this message in a way that is really your heart, and it might mean that I kind of go off script a little bit, which means I might have to come back and figure out where I am. So you'll have to cut that out of the tape later. But I also feel like there's something in this. And one of the things that I want you all to know is that, I don't know about you, but probably like no time in my ministry am I as concerned as I am now of what we see happening in the world around us, and especially in our country. And that doesn't mean that God is not on the throne, doesn't mean that everything Cal shared isn't true, but I think it holds weight that what Cal said is actually absolutely true. That there is no, in one sense, second vocation for any of us, even if you're the boss of a massive trucking company. The ultimate purpose of life is to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with as many people as God will open the door to do that, and that the gospel is still the answer to the cry of the human heart. And what we see happening around us is to me just a generation that feels like they've disconnected from that truth, and they're kind of wandering. So here's the issue. Here's what I'm going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the armor of God, but I'm going to talk specifically about the mind. And yes, I believe that means we all need to put on our helmet of salvation, which I kind of told you is not the right way of looking at that, but I'm doing it this week anyway. So I said we need to put on our helmet of salvation, which is all about being saved. It's all about knowing how you're saved and who you are, and that is a way that we protect our mind against all of the onslaught of the enemy. But we really need all the pieces of the armor, which I talked about last week. And we need to remember that it's God's armor. It's as I showed you in Isaiah, this is God's armor. It's Jesus is wearing it. He has the breastplate of righteousness, but he puts his armor on us. And as Paul said, it's an armor of light, which in fact is Christ himself. But this morning I am specifically looking at what we as believers need to think and believe. And even though we may technically have this helmet of salvation on, the enemy still bombards us constantly with ideas, with new thoughts, with crafty arguments designed, I think, to weaken our faith. It is designed to cause us to doubt his word, and oftentimes what he ultimately wants is to lead believers into sin. But I think the thing that the devil likes the most is when we adopt ideas that make us think we're actually doing God's will. even as we reject his clear directives that we find in his word. Sometimes as believers we minimize the importance of the mind. We may, and I've heard this many times because I happen to be, like theology and that, but I've heard people say, oh, I don't like theology. It's so divisive. And they will say, I just talk about God's love, and I get it. I love sermons that have wonderful stories that touch our emotions, and those are important. And I understand why sometimes people feel that way, because there are disputable matters that shouldn't divide us, and if we get too much into that, it just becomes confusing. But here's the point. We need to understand something, church, that what you believe matters critically. What you think and what you allow yourself to think matters. And what is the truth matters. These things become a pathway, and they either lead you towards God or they lead you away from his truth and his ways. We're going to look at 2 Corinthians 10, 3-5. This is a passage that I was going to look at last week, but we didn't get time to, but we're going to look at it this morning. Read it with me. We do live in the world, but we do not fight in the same way that the world fights. That's really important. Underline that. We fight with weapons that are different from those the world uses. This is the New Century Version, but sometimes I like to go to it. Our weapons have power from God that can destroy the enemy's strong places. And I wrote in there strongholds because most of the translations say that. We destroy people's arguments and every proud thing that raises itself against the knowledge of God. We capture every thought. Listen to that, church. And we make it give up, in a sense. We make it surrender and obey Christ. There's three things I want us to see in this text this morning. First, that we live in the world, but we know from other texts that we are not what? Of this world. Nor are our weapons the same as the world's weapons. We don't fight in the same way that the world fights. Our weapons are kind of the opposite of what the world's weapons are, where we might see a battle like when Russia and Ukraine are at war. Our way of waging war is actually to move in the opposite spirit, to love when others hate us. We put on this armor that we looked at last week, which is what? Righteousness, right? It's faith. It's the gospel of peace. It's the sword of the Spirit, and that's important because it's about the Holy Spirit, but it's also about the Word of God. And I really want to emphasize that this morning, because if we are going to resist the ideas that are bombarding us, you must, church, embed yourself in the Word of God. Can everyone say amen to that? And so this is our weapons are from God as well. These weapons are from God, and they have power, according to this text, to demolish strongholds. Now, I'm going to tell you up front that I'm going to do more talking about what strongholds are than about how we demolish them. I will get to that, but it'll be kind of a short one. But this morning I want to help you to identify some of the strongholds that we see in our current culture. Okay, so these weapons have power to destroy, but here's the last point we see in this text. Strongholds are ideas. They are arguments. And they are what I would call prideful. He says they puff themselves up. They set themselves up against the knowledge of God. Prideful ideologies that try to set themselves up against the truth of God, but not just the truth of God, the knowledge of God. Strongholds are thoughts and ideas and arguments that actually try and block you and others from coming to either a greater knowledge of God or to know God at all. A stronghold in the Old Testament was a city. And we only see one place where stronghold is used, the term in the New Testament. It's in this text. But Paul's doing something very, what's the word? Anyway, he's purposeful in this. So a stronghold was a city that was fortified in a way that made it kind of impossible to overtake, to capture the city. It was built up, maybe it was on a hill, it had great walls, it had defenses that would make it almost unassailable. And Paul uses this as a metaphor for ideas, for ways of thinking that have become so entrenched in either his world at his time, or we can bring it into our current culture. So these are ideas that are so entrenched in our current culture that almost everyone kind of assumes them or believes them, or great chunks of the population assume them or believe them without question. And it seems to me, anyway, no matter how logical our arguments might be against these ideas, people will not believe, they won't be changed, they kind of do this, they don't want to listen. They're blinded by the stronghold. They're blinded from the truth by the defenses that have been put up around the argument. To recognize, and what I want us to do is to recognize that we have this enemy. And this enemy is constantly trying to plant ideas into the minds of the world around us, but also into the church. And these ideas may seem good. They may seem like progress oftentimes, but they're actually designed by the enemy to turn us away from his truth. Now we're going to look at a couple of scriptures about this idea of what we think matters. And so Proverbs 23:7. Now this is the New American Standard Bible. And in case you didn't know this, I'll share it with you. There are different kinds of Bibles, and one of them, some of them are kind of like paraphrase. They try to really make it understandable for our culture today. So they change words to sound like words we understand. And in some ways, if you're reading one of those kind of Bibles, like it's not a paraphrase, but the New Living Translation uses very modern language. New Century that I just quoted uses modern language. And in some ways it's more accurate, right? Because if it's telling you what the word means, it helps you understand more, right? But then there's other people who love a Bible that is like almost word for word translated from the Hebrew or from the Greek, and it tries to match the most appropriate English word with that word that is in the Greek text. And so we would look at, those are kind of the word for word translations. And just so you know, the NASB is considered the most accurate word for word translated Bible. So I always tell people you want to have a few Bibles of different types of translations so you can look at this one. And why did I want this one for this particular text? Because it says this in Proverbs 23:7. Read it with me out loud. For as he thinks within himself, and I added the in his heart because lots of other translations have in his heart, and the heart is important here. So he is. What does that make you think? That whatever you're thinking, whatever is deep down in your heart, whatever you believe deep down in your heart, that actually is how you're going to act. That's who you really are. Now, I don't want to get into the whole thing of, we now have a new identity, all that. I'm just saying, what you believe matters. Are you with me? Now, the context of this, if you actually read it in Proverbs 23, is about a man who is saying one thing but is thinking something different. So if you read it, it's really about a miserly person who's saying to his guest, here you can eat all that you want, but inwardly he's either angry or he's counting the cost of the food the whole time, or he is figuring out how he can use his generosity to manipulate the person. And so he's basically saying that don't go to this miser's house because he's just tricking you. Because inwardly he's not being truthful. That's kind of the context of it. But with this is this point that we need to watch our own thoughts. You need to watch your own double-mindedness. You need to watch what is in your own heart. What do you believe? Because what you believe in here is, in a sense, who you are and how you'll act when the chips are down. In Genesis 6:5, we'll look at another text. The Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become. Now read this part with me. And that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. So what we see here is this idea of the thoughts of the heart. From the place of the thoughts of the heart come out all of this different kinds of evil. Things are first conceived in our minds, and then they become ideas, they become thoughts, they become worldviews, and out of that place develops actually all kinds of evil activity. Okay, Matthew 15:19 says this. Read this one with me. For out of the heart come evil what? Thoughts. Murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, and slander. Now many of those thoughts can be our own sinful thoughts that we all know pretty much are wrong. But what the point of that text is that they start as thoughts, but then the thoughts move to actions. And then, so they begin with something that's in our mind, something we believe, something that the enemy might be putting into our thought life, and then it moves us into action. But most of us, I think, would realize that if I'm having thoughts about murdering somebody, or if I'm having thoughts about adultery, or if I'm having thoughts about lying or stealing, most of us, I think, would recognize, gee, I shouldn't think that way. How many of you agree with me? How many of you realize that most of the world probably would, to some extent, agree with us? They would believe, well, gee, maybe the sexual immorality part they're not sure about anymore. But a lot of those things they would all agree, and they would think, I need to change the way that I'm thinking. But I think what I want to talk about today is that the devil is no fool. He knows that the only way that he can get large chunks of the population of this world actually doing some of those things, and they will actually do these activities that we all should recognize are sinful, but they'll do it on a mass scale. And the way that he does that is by making us believe, in one sense, that what the Bible says there is wrong under certain circumstances. So what the Bible is talking about there is kind of true, but at the same time, there are bigger fish to fry, and under certain circumstances, doing some of those things is actually not just wrong, it's actually right. And it's right because it involves my own rights. So this is, I think, a big way in which strongholds get developed. It involves my rights as a human being, or my personal identity. And so using those kinds of things, the devil can kind of shift the whole population into this place where suddenly we find ourselves in this society where we're justifying all kinds of things that fit into those categories. Do you guys understand what I'm saying? Do you agree with me? told you I'm kind of rant a bit today against. I do that a lot, I noticed, but anyway, sometimes you like it, sometimes you're like, I'm tired of this. But anyway, and I'm going to talk about something now that I know for a lot of women is a sensitive subject. But I need to talk about it because I think this is one of the biggest examples of a stronghold in our current culture. But I will say this. I'm going to talk a little bit about abortion, but I will say this. Abortion is not just a woman's sin. Abortion is, in my opinion, a sin of our whole society. And it's a sin because men have left so many women alone, unsupported. We talk so much about a fatherless. You need to understand, like the biggest issue probably in the inner city has nothing to do with abortion and everything to do with a fatherless generation that perpetuates this thing of fathers not filling their role, not being who God's called them to be, abandoning these women that they've often taken advantage of, and then not ever supporting them. Hello? So I don't want, and I also want to say this, if any woman here has ever had an abortion, God's grace is there. He forgives you. This is not an unforgivable sin. God loves you, and it's not just your sin. It's the man sin. It's in one sense our culture's sin because we support it so unabashedly. But here's the issue that I want to talk about with this one point. Those who are what I would call maybe the pro-choice activists, they go to great lengths, for instance, to never call the aborted child a child. Do you notice that? Have you noticed that, anybody? What do they call it? That bothers me the most is a product of conception. Have you heard that? I've heard that. Or they call it a fetal mass. Or they call it a fetus. They will call it anything but what most of us all know it is if we can get through the fog, and that is a human baby. And in any debate on the issue, they will say things like this. This is a fundamental reproductive right for all women that must be protected because it is not just a key issue, but it is, and we see this now with the overturn of Roe versus Wade in the U.S., probably like never before. I mean, it's just on the news all the time, and we have these women standing up, and they're saying things like, this is the key issue for women's rights and equality with men. Have you heard that? And I would say, why is it? I mean, in one sense, this has nothing to do with whether we believe that you're equal with men or you can do any job that a man can do and all that. We're not talking about that. We don't even. That's not even part of the argument from most of the pro-life side. Is the crux of the argument is we recognize that you have particular rights to your body, yes, but the complication is there is another body involved. And that's our whole argument, really. But they'll never, ever, ever address that. And think about it. They will completely ignore the reality that this other human being actually loses their life in the process. They just, no, we're not even going to talk about that. And what's also interesting to me, because I was a foreman and I saw a real change in progressions with women that are in industry, and what started to develop, I don't know if you guys understand this, but like the maternity leave now and the parental leave, I just wish they were around when I was having kids. Because I had 5 kids. 4 kids. 6 kids. We could have found another one in there somewhere, honey. But anyway, I could have had 5 years off work almost, But we didn't have any of that stuff back then. But we have so much now that we have, and I think it's good. I think it's a good thing. This is not a bad thing. We have subsidized daycare for single parents. We have all kinds of things that are there to help a woman who wants to have the child to actually not have to end their career. Don't we? And we will throw all this stuff there and bend over today to ensure that a woman having a child is able to continue her career if she chooses. We also always have the option of adoption. It means really there's only this 9-month window you can put your child up for adoption. And I always find the argument against that to be weird. Have you ever noticed what the argument against that is? It's this, and I've heard it many times, but once. Now, there is some good argument. Like, if somebody's been raped and then you force them to carry the baby for 9 months, that's harsh. I get that. But those are the extremes. The biggest argument that I've heard against it is, I'll fall in love with the baby and I won't be able to give it up for adoption. Do you understand the illogicalness of that argument? It says, I don't want to keep it for 9 months inside me because then I'll love it and I won't be able to kill it. Okay, now you guys are like, okay, Barry, you went too far on that one. And what I'm getting at is that here we are in this country, in Canada, and we have in this country the most liberal abortion laws in the world. I don't think people get that. Like and they have some ratings, like the Catholic Church was rating countries. Canada is at the bottom, the very bottom. Do you understand that about this country? We have no laws, which means there's no restrictions. It's really between the doctor and the mother, or the pregnant women. And I don't know if you know this, but it's true. I don't know if it's happened yet, but there is this movement within Planned Parenthood and things like that to actually move to what they'll call post-birth abortion. You can understand what that is. Because logically in their mind, and if you're anyone who's pro-life, you all understand this. If in Canada you're allowed to get rid of the child right up to the 8th month or 9th month, then why does a 2-hour or 1-hour journey through the birth canal change what you're allowed to do? Logically, am I ranting today? Why am I talking about this? And I understand it can be a hurtful thing. The problem is not just that we may have a disagreement about abortion. The problem is that we can never talk about it or just dialogue on it in a meaningful way, because all that you ever get back from legitimate questions of the things that I've just been talking about are shouts of unrelated rhetoric. Signs that say things like this: get your rosary off my ovaries. And that's the argument. Or stay out of my reproductive system. Or keep your religion away from me. Like somehow the only people who don't agree with this have to be religious fanatics. But see, it has nothing to do with our religion either. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with this one main issue. There's 2 lives here. And we can never talk about it. Why not? Because this is a stronghold. why am I bringing this up? This is probably, in my opinion, the greatest example of what we would see as a biblical stronghold in our society. It's an idea. It's a way of thinking. It's a belief system that has very little to do with logic and everything to do with their identity, with what they believe now about not having that right. And this is what we face. So how do we, in one sense, break down? Because one of the things that the Bible says is that the weapons of our warfare actually demolish strongholds. Do you have faith that actually God might demolish that stronghold? And whatever you think about what's happening down in the United States, for me, when they struck down Roe versus Wade, I thought, I can't believe it. And you know what it made me think? God can do anything. Right? Now that doesn't mean that the battle's won. Some states down in the United States are going to be more open. Other states, they'll get to choose. But anyway, and why in Canada are they so angry about it? If this is all down in the States and doesn't really matter anything about Canada, why do you think they're mad? We're so mad here. Because whether we acknowledge it or not, many of the laws in Canada and the United States sort of overlap. And if it's not a constitutional right, which was the crux of that issue, it is not a constitutional right to have an abortion. And if that's not true there, then there may be challenges to that truth here, and they get nervous about that. And so we have our own government scrambling to try and make sure that it becomes a constitutional human right. But that's just one example. There are many more in our society today. People are far more entrenched today in their political and social positions, really, than any time in recent history, I think. And meaningful, and I'll say this, humble and respectful dialogue is almost impossible. And I say that to say it can be from our side as well. We need to be respectful. We need to be humble. We need to come and talk in a way that is consistent with the weapons of our warfare. Hello? Right? Which are not the weapons that the world uses, which is like, let's hack them to pieces. No, this is about living a different way. But when you think about all that's happened in the last couple of years, and I know I'm going to be treading on, again, some sensitive areas, but from COVID vaccines to what are also the possible alternative pre-existing treatments for COVID, to vaccine mandates, to the suspending of our constitutional rights, to the trucker convoy that went to Ottawa, to the misinformation wars, each side crying that you're fake news, no, you're fake news, no, you're fake news. And it gets hard to know who's fake news. How many believe that? How many are like, it confuses me sometimes. But you know what really concerns me? And is the inability of all of us to some extent to emphatically, and that means empathetically, that's understand or try and understand the other person's position. Whether it is the person's concern with getting COVID so they get vaccinated and they can't understand why others don't want to. They feel like, why wouldn't you get vaccinated so that you can protect other people? You love other people. You're supposed to love people. Why aren't you worried about this disease that can kill people? And certainly that was there at the beginning was a real concern. So it can be from that end. But it could also be about understanding why others don't want the vaccine And whether the person is vaccinated or not, but that person is concerned about a couple of things: the loss of personal freedom, the loss of their medical health privacy that we have guarded, and we guard it for everything else except this. If they're concerned about what they see, the inequity that's happening today between those who did get vaccinated and those who didn't, or those who got vaccinated and just decided, I'm not going to download the passport because I just don't believe in the passport. I think it's dividing our country. I think this is an overreach, an overstep of our government. I'll get vaccinated for me personally because it's the right choice, but I don't like this idea of the haves and the have-nots. And I don't think it's scientifically based, that you can have 22,000 people all with their little vax things sitting in the general, arena, watching a hockey game, okay, and they're all screaming and yelling at each other, and you look on TV and half of them don't have their masks on. And then you listen to the news the next day, and it's those darn unvaccinated that are spreading COVID all over the place. And how many of the darn unvaccinated are there? Well, there's about 10% of the population that are unvaccinated. Oh, and what about them? They're not allowed to go into a restaurant. They're not allowed to gather in these 20,000 people stadiums. But they're the ones that are killing everyone. And you know what they forget, too? It's like, if you even come near me, and I've had this happen where it's like, if you even come near me, you're killing me, basically. And then you forget, wait a minute, number one, you've been vaccinated. So remember, you've taken away your ability to die from this, according to the health officials. Number two, even if I don't have any symptoms, so according to all the science, I'm probably not contagious. There's 2 days where I might be contagious and not have the symptoms. But other than that, most of the time, you have symptoms if you're contagious. And number three, even if you get it and you were unvaccinated, only about maybe 2% of the people ever end up in the hospital. So you're not going to die, most likely. And I'm not saying that to say that the point is that in this whole time, we're so entrenched in our little positions that we're not seeing things logically. You following me? And what's happening is these are becoming like strongholds. I won't even talk to you. I'm listening to the Prime Minister of Canada and saying basically, if you're unvaccinated, you're not a real Canadian. And it doesn't matter. You can go down the line of other things. There's critical race theory, human sexuality, gender dysphoria, parental rights. And I think the biggest loss that's happened in our society right now is the right to free speech. The right to disagree with people and not be either canceled in social media. And you might think, well, who cares if I'm canceled in social media? I don't like social media anyway. But you're missing what happens, actually, because if something gets out in social media, people lose their jobs, right? They get fired. And so you get canceled, you get basically maligned and so on if you don't take on the mainstream kind of view. And sometimes you get thrown in jail for it in our current culture. So when we look at this, today we see that sexual sin is celebrated as my God-given right and identity. This ongoing abortion of babies in the womb is seen as an unassailable human right, but not only that, today we are now required to also, I don't know if you know about this, rewrite all of our history books. Any of you heard about this? to judge all the founding fathers and leaders of both Canada, Britain, the U.S., any of the colonial countries through the lens of what I would call the current progressive ideologies of today. In other words, we're going to impose on everyone back then what they never would have thought. We're going to impose our particular views today on them and judge them because they didn't have them. And when we do that, we're going to then kind of cleanse our past, get rid of all the statues, deface them all. I mean, Abraham Lincoln was decapitated in one of the statues, I think, in Washington. Abraham Lincoln, think about that. Because he was suddenly a racist. And the problem is that we're called not just to judge those old people, and some things we do need to know what it was like, but we're called to throw out our common historical understanding of Western civilization and to rewrite it according to a new narrative that is basically kind of the narrative of the oppressed, the narrative of the marginalized. So what I'm talking about is the 1619 Project. How many of you have heard of that? Put your hand up if you've heard of it. A couple of you. Okay. And I want to say this first. If there is things that happened in the past that have been suppressed because the powerful wanted them suppressed, if there are actual events that shaped certain things that we ignore or we whitewash because we don't want the truth to come out, I am all for the truth coming out. Hello? Because the truth sets us free. It's always the truth that we need to embrace. And so if we've done things in our culture that are wrong, and we've done things, our leaders have done them, that are absolutely wrong to the First Nations people or to the black people, we can't whitewash that, and we need to embrace it. But I also think that it needs to be, in one sense, validated. We don't just believe it because somebody said that's what was in the mind. We have to know that actually that happened, and the motivation around it and all those kinds of things. We need to be able to question people about it honestly and openly, right? So I'm all for that. But this 1619 Project, I want to just share a little bit about it. It was released in a special issue of the New York Times Magazine. It is a collection of articles that aims to reframe America's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of black Americans at the very center of the United States national narrative. More specifically, it claims that the United States, and this is where I want you to understand this, is fundamentally and irrevocably racist. That's what they teach in this. Slavery, not the Constitution that happened in 1776, are the core of the American identity, and it views slavery not as a blemish that the founders grudgingly tolerated and were hoping and understanding that it should go away, but as the prize that the Constitution went out of its way to secure and protect. You guys following me? They believe that the War of Independence in the United States was because Americans were looking at England and William Wilbur and seeing some abolitionists over there, and they were scared that England was going to make them get rid of their slaves, and so they went and had the War of Independence. That's what the 1619 Project teaches, and they believe that in 1619 there was a group of black slaves that were brought over with some of the colonialists, and that those slaves actually are at the core and center of democracy in the United States. So some specific claims of the 1619 Project were that the Revolutionary War was fought above all to preserve slavery, that capitalism, this is what they teach, was birthed on the plantation. So it was birthed out of slavery, that capitalism, this system that we use, an economic system, is actually has its roots in slavery. And they also believed that certain features, this is what they wrote, of American society, like traffic jams or an affinity for sugar, were connected to slavery and segregation. So a lot of the critics said, we have no idea how you came to that particular understanding, but it's true. The project was condemned by historians from both the left and the right. Princeton, we're talking about Princeton historians, and so Princeton historian Alan Gelzo said that the 1619 Project is not history, it's a conspiracy theory. And like all conspiracy theories, the 1619 Project announces with a eureka that it has acquired the explanation to everything. Fellow Princeton historian Sean Willents has circulated a letter objecting to the project. The letter has signatures from the most esteemed historians in Ivy League: James McPherson, Gordon Wood, Victoria Bynum, James Oakes, all the leading scholars in their field. They objected to what they called the basic factual inaccuracies of the project. When they sent this letter to the New York Times refused to recant on anything that was written in the 1619 Project. 1619 Project was promoted by Oprah. I don't know if you know that. They now have a book written about it. And actually, this is the most concerning thing about the 1619 Project, is that public schools in America, 4,500 schools across the nation, are incorporating it into their curriculum. The Pulitzer Center helped turn the 1619 Project into a curriculum that now wants history teachers to abandon the traditional narrative of the War of Independence, the traditional narrative of the Civil War, that it was fought largely to free the slaves. They don't believe that. And the whole story of emancipation of the slaves, they want that rewritten, and they want the civil rights movement to also be changed. And what they're supposed to ask students is how the current societal structures continue to perpetuate the enslavement of black people in America. Now again, I'm not saying that some of what is written about the black people that came to America in 1619 shouldn't be added to the history books. They should actually be added to it, and they should tell the story. But it needs to be, this need to completely obliterate and replace our existing historical narrative, that is massively concerning. Why? I know you guys are probably bored now, but why? Why should you care about this? What we believe matters, and not just that, but if you can take away a whole people's sort of collective identity, and you suddenly rob them all of that collective identity, what happens is you create chaos. You create a massive vacuum in which you can come in with all kinds of different ideologies. This is what they did in Russia, and I know, it's always pulling the communist card here again. But here's the point. This is what they do. This is how you create revolution. And they have been teaching in our universities, and people again think I'm way too, but it's true that at a certain level, all of these ideas that they had at one time were in the upper echelons of academia. Critical race theory, all these things. They were debated at the highest levels of academia, and most of it never came down into here. We were like, we don't care. You guys can sit in your ivory towers and, talk about weird stuff if you want to. The problem is, ideas matter. The problem is that it filtered down to who? Our kids. We all sent our kids off to the university because it's the right thing to do. It's the best thing to do. Not knowing, and this is what Jordan Peterson talks about, that not all of them But there are a select group of university professors who see it as their mission to deconstruct all of our fundamental beliefs and to reshape the kids into little radical activists. And what we're seeing now that makes all of us go, what in the world is happening? Is the outcome of all of that over the years, because this stuff is not new. It's been being taught in these levels since the 60s and even before that. And so, there, let's go have coffee. So what do we do, though? What do we do about this? See, you might not think, oh, well, Barry, you know what happened to me and why I'm preaching you this message today? I know I'm over time, but I was watching a Netflix kids show. It was a cartoon. It's called Sea Beast. How many of you watched it? And here's what happens in Sea Beast. And it's a great little cartoon in some ways. It's cool. There's cute characters, little black girl. But you notice that there's always now in everything a mix of the appropriate cultural icons. Anyway, that's fine. I'm not a problem with that. But in it was a little black girl. And she wanted to be a hunter. But basically it said this. There was a king and queen. They were white. And they ran the kingdom. And there was a war that was going on between the sea beasts, between the sea monsters and humanity. And so they had developed hunters that protected people and the trade routes and all this from the sea monsters. And so they would go out and kill the sea monsters. And in the history books was written all the stories about the great hunters and how they were the heroes of the kingdom. What the little girl discovers, though, is that the sea monsters aren't actually evil. Do you see that one coming? The sea monsters aren't evil, and the wars are a lie. All the history books are a lie. They're all a lie. And at the very end of the show, after she convinces one of the sea hunters that he's wrong and he needs to love the sea monsters and not go to war with the sea monsters anymore, then she also convinces everyone in the kingdom that the king and queen are evil and bad and that we need to basically burn all of the history books or throw them out. That's the end of the cartoon. And I'm watching this and I'm thinking, what did I just watch? What's happening, folks, is that, and it makes me, I don't know about you, but it makes me feel like, first off, Barry, you shouldn't watch those kids' cartoons anymore because your mind is getting brainwashed. What do we do? And this is what I said. This is why I said I'm going to be heavy on how to recognize it and light on what to do. But in Romans 12:2, this is what it says. Do not conform any longer to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good and perfect and pleasing will. Don't be conformed. Don't let the world press you into its mold. And you need to realize that it's trying to do that to you all the time. Tons of times. You may not even recognize it, but there's going to be something coming at you, and you've got to recognize it. Say, wait a minute. Something in here is pushing me in the wrong direction. Guard your mind. Monitor your thoughts. Don't let everything that comes at you roll around in your head. It says, take every thought captive and make it obey who. And how do you know who Jesus is? This is what I meant in the beginning. Immerse yourself in the Scriptures. Know the Bible. And pray. Sometimes I don't mention prayer enough. But I think the greatest weapon we have is to get down on our knees in the midst of all this confusion and say, Lord, I need you to help me figure out what's going on. I need you to help me to walk through this with love, with compassion, but also standing in the truth. And then in Philippians 4:8, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, then what are we supposed to do? Think about those things. Bless you all.